This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by the patrons of Starwalker Studios. Learn how you can support the show at lexstarwalker.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 33 of Lex Out Loud, Writing Science Fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This is a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm writing my third novel and taking you along for the ride. So today, we're going to do something a little different. Probably already know this if you've listened to the last couple episodes, but I've been asking listeners for questions so I could do an Ask Me Anything episode, an AMA. So that's what we're doing today. I'm still working on my first draft, and I've been struggling lately to come up with things to talk about on the show, just because I'm in this part of the process right now where I can't so much talk about what I'm doing day to day. And I feel like I've really talked about everything world building related that I could think of right now. So yeah, I thought I'd do an AMA. I see people doing these all the time. And yeah, I thought it might be a fun thing to do for an episode. So I asked everyone to send me questions. The sky was the limit. And I got quite a few questions from a few different people. And I think actually most, if not all of these, are writing related or are questions relevant to the show. So this episode won't be quite so random and off topic as I thought it might be. So if you maybe had a question you wanted to ask and you didn't get a chance to get your question in already, that's all right. I can always do one of these in the future, or I could always just answer a random question on an episode occasionally. So if you have any questions you'd like to be considered, just send them my way. And yeah, we'll get to them at some point. So I actually, all these questions come from 3 different listeners. So I think what I'll do is I'll just ask each person's questions together. And we'll just go through it that way. So our first set of questions come from Eyes of a Bard. So Eyes of a Bard is a longtime listener of the show and a patron and member of our Discord community. And he gave me a few questions here to answer. So the first one is, what got you into writing? So that's a great question, very relevant to the topic of this show. So I think maybe I talked about some of this in the very first episode, the introduction episode. I don't know that I really went into specifically what got me into writing, but I talked a little bit about my history with writing and reading, because the two are intrinsically connected, right? So I've always been a very avid reader since I learned to read, which I believe was first grade. I think when they taught us reading, I think we learned a little bit in kindergarten, but I think it was first grade that we started learning to read. And I remember loving it from the beginning. I don't really know why, or I don't remember why I liked it so much or what it was about it. But I do know I grew up in the country. I lived in the middle of nowhere. There weren't kids my age that lived nearby. So especially before I started school, really the only person I saw or played with on a regular basis was my sister, who's a year younger than me. So I remember as a kid, I remember being bored a lot. And I remember I spent most of my young life outside. We lived on a farm. I spent most of it in the woods and in the fields, running around with my dogs, being a little kid, but usually by myself. And we lived in the country. We didn't have cable. This was before the internet. So, the only TV we had was the 2 or 3 or 4 stations we could just get, like regular broadcast TV. And, for those of you that are younger, you millennials and younger out there are fortunate you don't probably remember this because it was before your time, but it used to be TV was a very different animal than it is now. These days, I'd say, when it comes to video, the best stuff out there is on TV. The best entertainment, the best storytelling in that medium is happening on TV right now. These phenomenal shows that are being made, and the movies that are being made these days, for the most part, are kind of frankly embarrassing, honestly. So sometimes I wonder what people in other countries think of us and the movies that we make. It's like, do they never grow up? It's like all our movies are made for children. It seems like even the ones made for adults, a lot of them seem like they're made for children. But it didn't used to be that way. It used to be the opposite. It used to be, the best entertainment was in the movies, and TV was pretty awful. It was all a lot of sitcoms and laugh tracks. And I mean, how many family dramas can you have? How many family comedies can you have? Like, that's what everything was. There was no genre on TV. I'm someone that has loved sci-fi from as long as I can remember. And as a kid growing up, the only sci-fi I had that I could watch on TV was the original Star Trek, which was in reruns. I occasionally watched old Doctor Who, which was on the PBS station. I never really liked it, honestly. I didn't like it at all, but it was sort of science fiction, I guess. So I would watch it sometimes just because it was sort of science fiction, and that was all there was. But yeah, I didn't care for it. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, there's some kind of sci-fi adjacent stuff, like there was like an Incredible Hulk show and like some superhero crap even back then. But that was like it. There wasn't any fantasy on TV. The first real fantasy I remember was the what was it? The Chronicles of Hercules, whatever that Hercules show was, which I've seen some of it, but when it was being made, I never watched it. I think mainly because I think it was on pretty late at night, and I think maybe also it was on cable, and we didn't have a cable because we were in the country, and there's no cable in the country. So anyway, I'm rambling. My point is I didn't have much in the way of entertainment, and so most of my entertainment came in the form of books, and even there, selection was severely limited. I read a lot of books as a kid. Not because I really wanted to read them, but because it was kind of all there was. I would have loved to have been reading science fiction and fantasy, but I just didn't have access to it. So, I read every Hardy Boys book. I read every Nancy Drew book. I read every Bloodhound Gang book. I read loads of books like that were definitely not the first thing I wanted to read, but it was something to read. I read a lot of like classic novels and stuff as a kid. Believe it or not, just kind of desperate for things to read. I think the only fantasy I read, early in life was the Chronicles of Narnia. I got a hold of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe somehow through the school library or something, and I loved that book and found out it was part of a series, and I ended up getting all the books and reading them, and I really enjoyed those. But that was kind of it as far as fantasy, and not really anything as far as sci-fi. And then it was in middle school, I think it was my 8th grade year, that I read The Hobbit for the first time. And that's kind of what opened the door for me into fantasy. I ended up reading the rest of the Lord of the Rings. And then that was about the time I got into Dungeons and Dragons, and I started reading all of the D&D novels. There were Dragonlance novels and Forgotten Realms novels and Dark Sun novels and Ravenloft novels. And I read all that stuff through high school mainly. So, trying to get at this question, what got me into writing, I can think of one specific thing, but other than that, I don't really, there's not really a specific thing that got me into it. I think a big part of it was just, I've always been a reader. I always read a lot as soon as I could read. I often got in trouble in school for reading believe it or not. At least where I went to school, you could get in trouble for reading because I was always so bored in school that I would just start reading whatever book I was reading for fun in class. And I would get in trouble for that. This happened enough that I think it was in third grade. My teacher, I was always kind of a class clown. And a lot of that was because I was bored a lot. And I had a teacher in third grade who recognized that the reason I was causing problems in class was because I was bored. And the reason I was bored was because I wasn't being challenged at all by what was going on in the classroom. So she put me on my own reading program and she put me on my own math program. So basically everybody else in the class was doing their thing and I was doing my own thing, which was awesome. That was probably one of my favorite years of school. I was reading at least 2 years ahead of everyone else. I was reading like the 5th and the 6th grade books in third grade. And I was doing math. I think I was a year or two ahead in math. But unfortunately, after third grade, that all ended. And I was back with everyone else, bored to tears again. I would read on the school bus. It was probably about an hour trip on the school bus to school. It was only a 7-minute drive. If you just got in the car from where I grew up and drove to school, it was only 7 minutes. But of course, it took the school bus an hour to get me there. So I would usually read during the hour on the school bus to and from school every day. And that was elementary school, middle school, and even high school when I had the unfortunate, had to ride the school bus sometimes in high school, and I would read then too. I remember when I was in elementary school being made fun of for it by the older kids that I was reading on the bus, because I grew up in a part of the world where being smart was not cool, which explains, I think, a lot of what's going on in the United States right now. In a lot of this country, being smart is not cool, and that's why we're in the mess that we're in. For some reason, people in this country are in love with ignorance and to some degree, I think, stupidity. I don't know why. It's seen as a virtue by some, I guess. But so I think it's only natural when you read a lot to consider writing. I remember in elementary school, I think it was third grade, we had some kind of exercise where we wrote stories. And I remember I wrote a story. I talked about it in that first episode, so I'm not going to go into it now, but I wrote a story about Snoopy. And I really enjoyed that. My parents liked it. My teacher liked it. So that's the first time I remember thinking about being a writer, just because I had a lot of fun writing that story. And then everybody that read it said they liked it. Of course, I was a third grader, so who knows if that was true. Unfortunately, I think people praise kids a lot of times, whether they're deserving of it or not. And even as a kid, I knew that. So even as a third grader, when my parents and my teacher told me how good the story was, part of me wondered, is it really good, or are they just saying that? Still don't know. But I found that encouraging. I remember in high school thinking about being a writer, and I remember that's when I first started having the thought that when I was, quote, old and I retired, that I would write. That's what I would do. Because a lot of the authors I read, it seemed like that's what they did. Like they'd all had careers doing other things, and then in their later years, they became writers. So I just kind of thought that's how I would go. And then in college, I took some creative writing classes, specifically fiction writing and genre fiction writing. And that's when I wrote my first novel, was in college as part of one of those classes. I didn't write it for the class, but some of the exercises I did for that class became the first few chapters of the novel, and then I finished it. So yeah, I'd say up through that point in my life, I'd kind of always had this idea of, someday after I've had my career doing whatever, I'll retire. And when I'm an old man, I'll write so that I can do something, worthwhile, not just sit in my rocking chair and yell at kids who are on my yard or whatever. But I think the first time I really seriously thought about being a writer was far more recently. It was right before I met my wife. It was about, 12 years ago, something like that at this point. And I had this experience. You'll hear a lot of writers talk about this. Maybe every writer has had this experience. I kind of wonder because I've heard so many talk about it. But I had this experience where I was reading a book and I don't remember the exact book it was, but I remember what type of book it was. And I think I remember the author. I'm not going to tell you because I'm not here to bash other writers. But I was reading a book. I'll say it was a Star Wars book. I'll say that. I remember that for sure. The rest is, I'm not sure which book it was or even which author it was, but it was a Star Wars novel. And I was reading this book and I was just having numerous problems with the book. And I remember the one that I do remember, I don't remember most of like what I was taking issue with the book. But if you've read many of the Star Wars novels, you've probably seen this. It seems to be, at least everyone I've read, it seems like this is a thing where you start out the book with all these different characters in very different places in the galaxy. And then throughout the book, through some very contrived happenings, they all just happen to end up on the same planet in the same place for the end of the book. And it's not like they agree to meet there. It's always very contrived, like, oh, they just happen to be there. Yeah, that happens in, I think, every Star Wars book I had. It's awful. But this book was doing that really badly, among other things. And I think part of it also was I was reading a number of Star Wars books, like in a row. So it's always worse when you read numerous books that are doing the same things. But anyway, I'm reading this book. And at numerous points while reading this book, I kind of get this feeling of disgust with things that are happening in this book. And I find myself thinking, I could do better than this. I could write a better story than this. I should write something, and I mean, I've often had that experience reading a book, right? Where I find myself thinking I could do better than this. But for some reason this time when I had that thought, there was a part of me that said, well, then I should do it. It's easy to sit here and say, oh, I can do better than this, but I should prove it. I should actually do better and write a book. And I think another part of this was that this was, to kind of date myself a bit maybe, this was about the time that the Twilight books were really popular and they just started making the Twilight movies. I think, actually at this point they hadn't started making the movies yet, because the first Twilight movie came out while I was writing my second novel, which was a vampire novel. But the books were really popular at this time. And I remember, all these adults who normally didn't read were reading these Twilight books, which are YA books, by the way. They're written for teenagers. So yeah, I don't know if you remember that, but there was this weird time where those books were everywhere and a lot of people were reading them. And specifically a lot of people who normally did not read for fun were reading these books for whatever reason. I was playing the role-playing game Vampire at the time and had been running that game for years. And it was kind of this coming together of these different things, reading these books and thinking, I can do this. I can do better than this. The fact that this series of books about vampires were suddenly very mainstream and very popular. The fact that I had been running a vampire game for years and had characters I'd created for that and stories I'd created for that I'd never really used. So I had all this material just kind of laying around. So all these things just kind of came together and I was like, you know what? I should write another novel and I should write a vampire book. And vampires seem really popular right now. And it wasn't just Twilight. I'm trying to think what else was going on. Well, Buffy was over at this point, but was still in, recent memory. I think Angel was over at this point, but was still in recent memory. So, vampires had gone from this kind of weird horror fringe thing to like very mainstream all of a sudden. And I'd always been into vampires since I was a little kid. I've read every classic vampire book and including a lot of ones you've never heard of unless you're really into vampires yourself. So I was like, I should write a vampire book. I've read every classic vampire book there is, and most of the popular vampire books, or not popular, most of the modern vampire books that I could find. So there's not someone out there that's better versed in the quote lore than I am. I feel like I can do better than some of these books I've been reading recently. And so I should do it. And I was also at a time in my life where I was kind of in a time of transition, and I was looking for new things to do and new ways to spend my time and whatnot. And this was all kind of all at the same time. This was also about the time that I learned that Robert Jordan had passed away, and that Brandon Sanderson was going to finish the Wheel of Time. And the only reason that that's relevant is it's happened about the same time. And I was thinking about maybe writing a book, and I was kicking around some ideas, and I don't know what came over me, but I decided to email Brandon Sanderson. And I think part of the email was just, hey, I found out you're doing the Wheel of Time, and that's really awesome. At this point, I didn't know who Brandon Sanderson was. I'd never heard of him. But I emailed him, and I asked him some writing questions and some questions about some ideas I had for books I could write. And the man actually wrote me back. And not only did he write me back, but he wrote me a very long, very thoughtful email in which he answered all my questions in depth. He gave me really thoughtful opinions about, my book ideas. I remember one of them, I had this idea about something on a generation ship, and he was basically telling me that my ideas weren't terribly original, and that had all been done numerous times before, which I didn't actually realize at the time, and just recommended that, I read books that are similar to what I want to do so that I know what's already been done, so I don't just repeat what someone else has already done without knowing it, so I can do something different. I still have the email somewhere that he sent me. It was 3 pages long. I mean, Brandon, he likes to talk and he likes to write, but it was a beautiful email. And even more than that, just that he took the time to write back to me, some guy that he didn't know, who's a nobody, who was just thinking about maybe writing seriously. So that was really encouraging and got me fired up. And I, looked into Brandon. I found his Mistborn trilogy and read those and really liked those. I found out he was doing a writing podcast, Writing Excuses. I started listening to that. I started listening to other writing podcasts, and just into the deep end I went. And I wrote my second novel. I think it took a little over a year to write. During the time I wrote that novel, I moved from Indiana to Chicago, and then from Chicago to Seattle. During that time, I met my wife and got married, and yeah. And from that point, I was a writer. And even in the, 10 or so years since I finished that book and until I started this one, I always had every intention of writing more books. And like I've said on the early episodes of the show, a lot of the ideas for the setting for this book I'm writing now, I started working on way back then when I was still writing the second book. So in a long roundabout way, that's how I got into writing. But, if there was one moment that really was the tipping point, I think it was having that experience multiple times of just reading a book and thinking, I can do as good as this. I can do better than this. So if you're someone that's had that experience, maybe try writing something, because you hear that a lot from writers. I'm not alone on that. In fact, I kind of wonder if it's universal. I suspect it might be, but who knows? All right, Eyes of the Bards. Next question is, what are my top 3 genres to read? That's actually pretty easy. I don't read that many different genres today, though I have throughout my life read probably just about everything. But I would say my favorite genre is definitely top number 1 is science fiction, for sure. A good sci-fi is always my favorite thing. I would have to say, actually, my second after science fiction would be nonfiction. Anything science related or anthropology related or history related, I find really, really interesting. And then my third favorite genre to read would be fantasy. I can still get into a fantasy now and then, but I have read so much fantasy over the years that it either just needs to be something just amazingly well done, like The Wheel of Time, or it needs to be something very different. Because, that's one of my problems personally with fantasy as a genre, as a reader, is that so much of it is the same. Now, I know that's less true now than it used to be, but it's still true a lot. That so much of fantasy is just an iteration on what we've already seen. And when you've read as much of it as I have, you get to a point where it's kind of like when you watch a Marvel movie and you're like, haven't I seen this movie like 5 times already? It's kind of like that. Isaac the Bard's next question is, what are your top 3 genres to write, regardless of writing quality? Yeah, it's the same 3 in the same order. Number 1 is science fiction. Second would be nonfiction. And then third would be fantasy. The only addition here is as far as nonfiction, I do enjoy writing kind of how-tos, like how to do something or explaining something. I enjoy that. All right, Isaac the Bard's next question is, what is your favorite genre of music and why is it ska? You know what? There was a day, maybe years and years ago, where I might have said it was ska back when I was a serious trumpet player, but I kind of missed out on the ska thing. It was just happened at the wrong time for me. If it would have happened a little earlier in my life, or even possibly a little later, I probably would have jumped on that wagon. But when ska kind of had its moment of popularity, at least where I was living, was at a time that I wasn't playing trumpet anymore, and I was really into music that we at the time called alternative. I don't know what they call it now, grunge, but I was really into that at the time. So I heard some ska, I enjoyed some ska, but I never really got into it. My musical tastes are kind of all over the map. Honestly, it would be easier to list off the types of music I don't like than to tell you the types that I like. So the types of music I don't like are gospel or anything Christian, contemporary Christian gospel, anything like that. Yeah, that's at the top of the list of music I can't stand, followed by country. I don't like country. Now, there's some country I can appreciate, especially if it's got a good bass line. But as a rule, I don't like it. Don't care for it. So yeah, religious music, country, and that's pretty much it. I don't really like opera singing. I mean, I can appreciate that those people have talent and all that good stuff, but I don't like listening to it. For instance, I love classical. That's what I listen to when I'm writing, specifically Mozart, whenever I can. And I used to have these great Mozart CDs. Yeah, back when people used to have CDs. I'm old. That I loved and I listened to all the time. I no longer have them, and they're sold. You can't buy them anymore. So I just actually discovered that I have a whole bunch of, quote, free music through Amazon Prime, through Amazon Music, because I have Amazon Prime. So I started building a Mozart playlist on there that I can listen to while I'm writing. But unfortunately, a lot of the Mozart out there has vocals, has these opera singers screaming away. And I just can't stand that, especially when I'm writing. So I have to remove those from the playlist whenever they rear their heads. But other than that, I pretty much like all forms of music, but I do have my preferences. I've been learning and playing bass for the past few years now. And even before I started learning the bass, that was the part of a song I was always drawn to, and usually was what determined if I like the song or not. It seems like most people, especially people that aren't themselves musicians, just listen to the vocals of a song. They listen to the lyrics and the singing, and that's really all they pay attention to. And that's what determines if they like a song or not, whether or not they like the lyrics or whether or not they like the person's voice or whatever. But for me, it's always been the bass. That's what I listen to, the bass and the drums. And if it's got a groovy bass line or an awesome bass line, I'll like the song. And if it's got a boring bass line, I probably won't like it. So these days, I would say my favorite types of music would be music with a good bass groove, something that you can't sit still to while you listen to it. Music that I find that does that for me tends to be EDM, electronic dance music, R&B, disco, maybe a little funk, stuff like that. But I also, I grew up on classic rock. I still really enjoy classic rock. I don't so much get into what my wife calls the hardcore stuff anymore. I used to, when I was in high school, I listened to a lot of metal and don't so much listen to metal anymore. And like I said, I was really into alternative for quite a while and don't so much listen to that anymore. It doesn't help that so many of my favorite bands from those days aren't around anymore because one or more members either OD'd or committed suicide, which is really sad. But yeah, these days, EDM, dance, trance, R&B, disco. That's what gets me grooving. This Bard next asked, how do I learn best? This actually started out as what is my quote learning style, which I talked about on a previous episode. The Bard is actually what kind of got me onto that because I'd seen the Veritasium video on that in my feed, but I hadn't watched it. And he asked that question and it reminded me, it's like, oh yeah, there's this video I've been meaning to watch about that. And that's when I learned that there's nothing to that, which honestly wasn't a shock to me. I kind of suspected as much just because I am someone who spent a lot of my life in academia and spent a lot of time observing and thinking about how I learn and how I teach. And my observation has always been, multimodal is best. So I learn best by doing, definitely. So if it's something hands-on or something that you do, the point where I really grok it is when I can actually do it myself and actually practice it. So for instance, the bass guitar, it's like, yeah, I can learn by watching some theory videos or whatever, but I learn a lot more by actually just physically practicing it. So yeah, practical experience is definitely the best teacher, I think. But I also learn really well by reading. I tend to remember pretty much everything I read, almost word for word. I don't have a photographic memory. It's not that good. I wish it was. But I tend to remember things that I read. Numbers, things like that. Can oftentimes quote things word for word, things like that, if I've read it at all recently. So I learn really well by reading things. I know some people don't. Some people don't learn so well just by reading a textbook or whatever. But I do. And finally, I love a good diagram or a chart. My few years I spent working in biotech taught me a love of charts and diagrams. And yeah, especially when you're talking about complicated data, there's no better way oftentimes to wrap your brain around it than through some kind of diagram or chart, graph, things like that. So yeah, as far as how I learn best, a combination of physical experience and reading and practicing is what works best for me. All right. So thank you, Isa the Bard, for those questions. Really, really appreciate it. I hope I answered them to your satisfaction. Other than, of course, the one about why my favorite music isn't ska. But I like ska. I can get down to some ska. I bet it'd be fun to play bass too, actually. Yeah. All right. Next up is Lord Garglemon, who also submitted some questions for us today. So he wanted to know some of my favorite characters, maybe top 3. And then he narrowed it down for me. So he says, maybe narrow it down to a favorite character from a book, one from a movie, and one from a game. So I think this is actually a really hard question. Just because I've read so many books and seen so many movies and shows and been exposed to so many characters. I'm sure I've forgotten far more than I remember at any given time. I'm sure I've forgotten most of them. So really, unfortunately, just the nature of my flawed memory, my answer is really going to be more along the lines of what's my favorite character that I've encountered recently, because I'm not going to think of a character I read in some book 10 years ago, most likely. So this is going to be more pulling from stuff I've recently been exposed to. But with that in mind, as far as a character from a book, I really love the character Egwene Alver from The Wheel of Time. So if you've read those books and you know all about her and she's awesome. If you haven't, go read the books. And also there's a TV show coming soon. So hopefully they will do her character justice. But she's a really awesome character. She's someone you can look up to. She's brave, strong, courageous. I guess brave and courageous mean the same thing, don't they? She's a good leader. She's a good friend. She's someone who does what she thinks is right, no matter what. She's someone who puts others' needs ahead of her own. She lives a life of service. She's just an amazing person. She's also got a fantastic arc through those books. And I can't say too much about her arc because I don't want to spoil anything for those of you that haven't read the books. But she starts out as a pretty ignorant person. She's a young girl, daughter of an innkeeper who grew up in a very small village out in the middle of nowhere. I can relate. So she starts out very ignorant of the ways of the world, very ignorant of any other cultures other than her own. And by the end of this series, she's grown a lot from that. She's become a leader, as I said, a very good leader. She's become a powerful person, both politically and in her own right. She makes a lot of really tough decisions, and I think pretty much always, if not always, makes the right decision or the best decision she could make. She shows courage, compassion, a strong sense of duty. And yeah, she's just an exemplary person. She's heroic in that way, that she's someone we can look up to and strive to be more like. And she's got an amazing arc. She starts from very, very humble beginnings and goes much further. And again, I don't want to say more. I don't want to spoil things. But honestly, I think she has the best arc of all the characters in the book. Most people would probably say that Rand is the main character as far as that book has a single main character. It really doesn't. It's a cast of characters. But if there is a main character, it would be Rand. And I would agree with that. But in a lot of ways, Egwene would be main character number 2. And I think she has a better arc, a more satisfying arc than Rand does. And yeah, I can't really say more without spoilers, but if you want to see a fantastic character arc done well, and if you want to see the long con of a character who changes a huge amount gradually over a very large story, check out Egwene Alver from The Wheel of Time. You will meet her within the first 2 or 3 chapters, I think. She's in it from the very beginning. And yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think there might actually be a few chapters from her point of view in the first book. The first book is mainly from Rand's point of view, but if I remember right, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 chapters from Nynaeve's point of view, and I think there might be a few from Egwene's point of view. Because there's a point in the first book where they split up, And Perrin and Egwene go off by themselves, and I think we get points of view from both of them. And then Nynaeve goes off with Moiraine and Lan, and we get points of view from Nynaeve there, if I remember right. And then Rand and Mat are together. But we don't actually get any points of view from Mat in that book, I don't think. But yeah, fantastic series and a fantastic character. All right, favorite character from a TV show. So again, this is just coming from recent memory because there's too much that I've seen there to remember it all. But as I mentioned, I think last week, I started watching True Blood again recently, and I just really love the characters of Pam and Eric in that show. There are a couple of vampires in that show. They're both pretty old vampires. Eric is really old. I think he's from like the Viking age or whatever, if I remember right. And they're just hilarious. The acting for them is fantastic. Pam is just always has this dry sarcasm that I can't get enough of. A more recent character that I also love, that I just thought of, that Pam kind of reminds me of, is Margot from The Magicians. So if you watched The Magicians recently and you remember Margot, how could you not remember Margot? Oh, she was fantastic. But remember how Margot has that kind of snarky, sarcastic, kind of dry sense of humor. Pam is very similar. So imagine Margot as a vampire and you've got Pam basically. And yeah, Eric's great too. And they're really great together, the way they interact. And I always really wish that they would get their own spin-off show, but never came to be. Yeah, and I don't know. If you've seen it, you know why I love them. But otherwise, it's just hard to describe. But I just love their humor and how they treat one another and how they treat other people. And yeah, they're just hilarious and such great actors. And Lord Gargamon also asked about a character from a game. I have been playing a lot of video games the last couple of years. But I racked my brain and I couldn't really think of a character from a video game that I was like impressed by or that I thought was noteworthy. So I don't have something for that. All right. Lord Gargamon's next question wants to know my favorite D&D module and or adventure. So actually, when it comes to D&D, I've actually much preferred my own homebrewed adventures that I've created myself to any of the published ones that I've ever read or run or played. But if I had to pick a published one as my favorite, I guess I would probably say the original Ravenloft adventure, not the Curse of Strahd that they recently put out for 5th edition, which was basically the original Ravenloft adventure with a bunch of filler added in. And it is, in my opinion, most of it filler, which is why I'm saying the original adventure, because that adventure was pretty great. But the filler just waters it down, in my opinion, in Curse of Strahd. So yeah, that was a really good adventure. And I'd kind of like to run it. I started running Curse of Strahd, but we never actually got to Castle Ravenloft. We were still waiting through all the filler material when we stopped playing that. As far as the favorite adventure I've ever run, not published or just favorite period, I'd say my favorite was probably a Changeling adventure I ran where the characters went very deep into the dreaming. So if you haven't played Changeling, the dreaming's kind of like Never Never Land from Peter Pan. It's this, or it's like a fantasy world. Or if you play D&D, it'd be kind of like the Feywild kind of thing. It's like another world or another plane that is created by the imaginings of people. So it's a place where dreams are alive, where things people have dreamed and imagined become real. So your characters can go there. And so in this particular adventure, the characters were in this realm, and the deeper you go into the dreaming, the less grounded things are and the more magical and the less like real reality things become. Laws of physics break down, things like that. And if you spend too much time there, you can actually lose your mind because there's nothing for your human mind to like kind of hold on to. There's nothing stable there. So they went so deep into the dreaming and they were there so long that they were in real danger of losing their minds. And they almost didn't make it out of it, almost didn't make it back. So that was a lot of fun. That was a very long running campaign that we played. And it just had a lot of unbridled creativity because in the dreaming, literally anything can happen and anything can be there that you want. So, there were everything from magic swords to talking animals to X-Wings and lightsabers, all kinds of stuff. I would just pull ideas from anything I could think of and, from any genre, anything. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. Here's a flashback for you. For those of you that have been with me from the GM Intrusion days, I don't know if any of you listen to this show, but if there are any of you out there, you may remember how back when I was doing GM Intrusions and we were eagerly awaiting The Strange to come out, that I was thinking The Strange was going to capture some of what I loved about the dreaming, the ability through these different worlds in The Strange to kind of be able to do anything. Ultimately, The Strange ended up not really working for me as a game or as a setting. But yeah, if you guys listen to that show back then you'll probably remember me going on and on about the dreaming and Changeling and how much I loved it. And yeah, I still remember those days. I had a lot of fun with that. All right, Lord Garglemon's next question is, what is my favorite genre of game? So as far as tabletop RPGs go, I'd have to say sci-fi, at least theoretically. I haven't actually been able to find a science fiction RPG that I really like to play or to run. I really want to like the Star Trek game, but and the system itself I like, but the source books are really I don't know that they're so much badly written, but they're not edited either at all or not edited well. They're full of errors and typos and misspellings, and that's bad enough when you're reading like a novel or something. But when you're reading a book that's supposed to teach you how to play this very complex game, it makes it into a real headache, and it's just too much of a pain in the ass to try to make sense of it. And then to try to run one of their published adventures, oh my God, it's such a mess. You basically have to, I ran one of their published adventures and I basically had to rewrite almost the whole thing to have something I could actually use at the table that wouldn't just confuse the crap out of me. So, yeah, I'd love to see either a massive revision of that game with good editors, or barring that, some other company take a stab at a good Star Trek game, maybe riffing off what they did, because they had some really good ideas. I think the system was going in the right direction and all that. It's just that the writing and the editing was atrocious. But yeah, I haven't really found a sci-fi system that I like. I'd really like to, because I'd love to find a good sci-fi game to play and run. And before you all give me all the, people always suggest the same systems, and I've seen Traveler, I've seen Shadowrun, I've seen the various Star Wars out there. And yeah, I don't care for any of those, systems. So yeah, the one that I have not tried that I think possibly looks promising is Eclipse Phase. But honestly, I don't think I would ultimately end up liking that system, especially to run it. It might be okay to play, but I don't think I'd want to run it. It seems pretty unwieldy. But yeah, I'd love a good sci-fi RPG. Maybe someday. I have a feeling I'm going to have to come up with my own system. But barring that, I'd say games in a modern setting like Vampire or Changeling. As far as video games, my favorite type of game would be sci-fi RPGs. We definitely need more of those. Please and thank you. Favorite tabletop RPG system. That's what Lord Garglemon wants me to answer next. What's my favorite tabletop RPG system? Gosh, I hate to sound like so unoriginal, but I'd have to say 5e D&D right now. I'd love to find a better system. I really would. But especially when it's sci-fi, but I haven't. 5th edition D&D, it hits that sweet spot of not too complicated to run or to understand or to teach to your players, but also has some complexity. So, there's some nuance there. I used to play a lot of Numenera, the Cypher system, and that game is super simple to run. It's fairly simple to teach. It's a little weird. Like some of the base mechanics seem a little more non-intuitive and a little more complicated than they need to be, like multiplying your difficulty by 3 to get the target on the D20 die. I feel like there's got to be a more elegant way to do that. But other than that, the system's pretty easy to use and easy to learn for the GM and the player. My big problem with the Cypher system is it's too simplistic. There's really no depth to it. So honestly, I'm okay with it as a GM, because as a GM, I don't really care about that so much. But as a player, there's just not enough there for me to sink my teeth into. And that's why I keep coming back to D&D. It's so hard to hit that sweet spot. There's so many RPG systems out there that are just way too complicated. They're way too difficult to run. Like, for instance, the West End game, or not West End games. Wow, that's old. The Fantasy Flight game, Star Wars game. I would love to love that game. And I tried to love it for a long time. But it is just way too unwieldy and too much of a pain in the ass to run. It's just not worth it. So you got a lot of games like that are just overcomplicated. And then you have games like Cypher System or Fate that are just way, way, way too simplified and too dumbed down and just too simplistic. There's just no depth to them. There's no every role is the same. Every role feels the same. It doesn't seem any different no matter what you're doing, whether you're climbing a wall or in a combat or investigating. It's all the same. It all seems the same. And Cypher System, so often to me, it just ended up feeling like we're just flipping a coin. I'm like, why don't we just flip a coin and this be even faster and easier? And it's about the same result. So, it's hard to find that sweet spot where, it's easy to learn and it plays fast and you can adjudicate things on the fly really quickly and easily. But yet there is, not every role is exactly mechanically the same. And there are different mechanics and systems that interact with each other. I understand I'm asking for a lot. It's hard to find that sweet spot. And at least for now, right now, to my knowledge, D&D 5e is the one system I found that does that. And it's too bad because it's a class-based system, which I don't like. And it's fantasy, which is not my preference. And I don't think the adventures published for it are that great, unfortunately. But there you go. As far as system, I guess that's my favorite right now. But if there's a system you love that you think is better, let me know, because I'm always ready to find a better system. All right, next question is favorite thing to cook. So this is a hard one too. I've been doing a lot more cooking over the past year, partly because of the pandemic and quarantine and all that fun stuff, and just partly trying to be healthier and eat better. And the best way to do that is to cook for yourself. That's the first step in eating better, is to cook your own food. So there's a lot of stuff I enjoy cooking. A big thing I've gotten into in the past year or so is making sourdough bread and just making everything sourdough. So I'd say my favorite thing right now is making homemade pizza with sourdough pizza crust, homemade sourdough pizza crust. It is the best pizza I've ever had, like literally, even counting pizza from these crazy expensive restaurants. It's way better than any other pizza I've had. It's delicious. And we usually keep it really simple with just crushed tomatoes, basil, salt, pepper, olive oil. And we use like a pizza cheese blend. I think it's mozzarella, provolone, and Asiago. And that's it. That's it as far as toppings. But it is delicious. It takes a lot of time to make. Just making the dough for the crust takes a couple days. You have to start it the day before. But it's the best pizza I've ever had. So it's worth it. All right. Next up with questions is our listener, Helga. So Helga's first question is, what are your writing style inspirations? All right. So we're getting back to writing stuff now. So this isn't going to shock anyone that's listened to recent episodes. I'd have to say Stephen King's book on writing is a pretty big inspiration for me right now, just because I've recently listened to it 2 more times for 3 times total. So it's pretty strong in my mind right now. It's in the buffer right now. And I've been trying to put some of his ideas into practice because he is just out the gate. He has a different approach than I do, than I've taken in the past. He's more what we often call a discovery writer, which at least for my previous novels is not how I approached it. So I've been trying some of his strategies, which is actually where my brute force writing came from, is kind of taking some ideas he presented in his book and kind of putting my own spin on them to make them work for me. So that's a huge influence right now. He's also where I got the idea of trying to write 2,000 words every day. So that's a big one. I'd say another big influence on my writing, if only because I've read it so much, and it's so many words that I've read so many times, would be The Wheel of Time. Now, I don't so much try to emulate Robert Jordan's writing style. I think it's actually, I think that would not be a good thing for me to do, because I think his writing style is a little description heavy for most readers these days. I mean, so many books I read these days have almost no descriptions. Again, I'm not going to name names, but there are certain books I've read in the last year or two that seem to all take place in the white mist. You know, the locations are hardly described at all, if at all. The characters aren't described at all. If there are spaceships, they're not described. Like nothing is described at all. Or very, you're given a word or two at most to describe something. So yeah, I feel like that's the human thing of always overreacting to things. I've noticed this. It seems like anything humans do, we're like a clock pendulum slowing down, right? Like something's wrong. Like people are like, these books have way too many descriptions. It takes too long to read them. It bogs the pacing down, blah, 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 blah. So in reaction to that, all these writers write books with no descriptions at all, which is the pendulum swinging all the way the other way. And then, people react to that. It'd be like, oh, these books don't have any descriptions. Everything takes place in a white mist. I don't know what any of the characters look like, blah, 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 blah. So then they'll go back to way too much description. It's like we can never find the happy medium. We always have to go from one extreme to the other. So yeah, Robert Jordan's books are very description heavy. Too much so for the modern reader, I think, fortunately or unfortunately. I mean, personally, my opinion, I think Robert Jordan went a little overboard. Some of his descriptions are a little long. It's a little bit much, more than you need probably, more than you can honestly hold in your head at one time. You're going to lose details just because he gives you so many details. But a lot of books that are written today that I read now are way too far the other way, and there's no description. Or the only thing worse than never describing your main character is waiting until halfway through the book and then describing your main character. Oh my God, that's a huge pet peeve of mine. It's like by halfway through the book, I've already decided for myself what the character looks like, and now you're going to tell me that they look like something different. If you're going to describe a character, describe them the first time we meet them. That's when you should describe them, not halfway through the book. But anyway, so I don't try to emulate Robert Jordan's style because I wouldn't want to write that way. I think it's too description heavy. I think that it's a little too plotting a lot of times, plotting with a double D. It plods along. So I don't try to emulate him as far as his writing style, as far as that goes. But I'm sure he influences me just because I've read him so much. And one aspect of his writing that I do try to emulate, or that I would like to, is his mastery of the limited third-person limited point of view. He excels at this, and I've yet to read someone who does it better than he does. And I would be very happy to do as well at third person limited as he does. So that is something I try very hard to learn from him. I'd say another thing that, influences my writing style definitely is whatever the latest books I'm reading are, good or bad, whether I like the books or I dislike the books, whether I think the books are well written or poorly written, I think they influence me. I think I learn almost as much reading a bad book or a poorly written book or a book that has some problems as I do reading a good book or a book that's really well written or a book that doesn't have any problems. Although I think as I get more experience, maybe this becomes less true. I think there's only so much you can learn from badly written things, and that those are more lower level things, more beginning to intermediate level stuff. And I think when you get to intermediate to advanced stuff, you're not going to learn that from reading something done badly. Usually you're going to have to read stuff that's actually well written. But yeah, I mean, you can learn quite a bit from reading something that you think is badly written. You can learn what not to do. And even more importantly is try to figure out what is it that they're doing that is making this such an unpleasant experience for me. And if you can figure that out, then, you have another thing that you know not to do in your own writing. For instance, this writer never describes the main character, or this writer waits till halfway through the book to describe the main character for the first time. That might be something. On the other hand, I think there's a lot more that you can learn from reading really good writing. And I think that a big reason for that is that, bad writing is kind of obvious in a way. Or your negative reaction to it is obvious, maybe that's what it is. But it's like, it's not hard to realize when you're reading something that you don't like it. And it's often not much harder to figure out exactly why you don't like it. I don't like this because no one talks the way this character is talking. Or I don't like this because I don't believe this character would actually do this or say that. Things like that. Like it's usually, if we sit and think about it, we can figure out what it is happening that we don't like or what the problem is. But when you're reading something that's really well written and you're trying to figure out what is this writer doing that makes this so good, that makes this work so well for me, that can be more difficult. And I think the reason for that, or one reason for that, is that a lot of times those things are really subtle. And they can be hard to pick up on. So yeah, it can be a lot harder to figure out exactly what a writer is doing that is making something work so well. That can be really difficult because a lot of times it's something really, really subtle. Where on the flip side, if you're reading something that you're reacting negatively to, it just seems a lot easier to tease out what exactly is happening there. All right. Well, that's it. We've reached the end of the questions, and I see my recording's plenty long. So I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So I want to thank Eyes of a Bard and Lord Garglemon and Helga for submitting all these questions today and giving us our episode today, basically. And those were really great questions. And I think almost all of them were writing related, and the few that weren't, I think, were even somewhat related. So, I mean, I thought AMAs were usually like random questions like, what brand of toilet paper do you use? But I don't know. You guys kept it really on topic. So that's cool. So yeah, thanks again for sending questions. And again, if you have a question, feel free to send it my way. Maybe I'll do another one of these in the future, or maybe just occasionally I'll just answer a listener question on the show, or maybe I'll just answer you directly, in the Discord or email or however you get a hold of me. So speaking of that, if you would like to get a hold of me, if you have a question or a comment or ideas for what I could do in future episodes, things you're wondering about, I've got some great ways you can get a hold of me. First off, you can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker. I also have a voicemail you can call. So you can call that on your phone and leave me a voicemail message. That phone number is 951-465-5391. And finally, you can join our community on Discord. You can find a link to join in the show notes at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. So thanks for tuning in today. And this was fun. Let's do this again sometime. So I hope that you're plugging away at whatever project you're working on. And just keep at it. And again, if you're working on something and you'd like to share it in the Discord, that'd be awesome. Or share it with me, that would be awesome. And love to know what you're working on. And I'm sure others in the community would as well. Also too. All right. Well, thanks for listening. And I'll be back soon with another episode. So until then, keep writing.